A yokel can leave a village, but the village will never leave the yokel. That's a Polish saying adopted by many cultures with little twists. As for Eritreans, when we are in our fascistic mood, we don't like to adapt other sayings. We have living examples that illustrate the idea better. Hello, my name is Saleh Johar. I'm the editor and publisher of Awati.com and the producer of Negarit channel. For the last 20 years, I've been writing and commenting on Eritrean affairs, focusing on reconciliation, stability, and peace. And that means I have come across many views. Some I learned from, some were just a waste of time, and some dazzled me and I had to scratch my head. My topic for today is the most annoying I have come across in the last 20 years. I will address a twisted logic devoid of any rational thinking. I would say it's fit for, but on second thought, find out for yourself.
When we talk about Eritrea, it is the Italians who built Eritrea, who create the very nation of Eritrea. And with it comes the map of Eritrea. Now, think about this. You are an elite, and you want to create an identity, an Eritreanness, based on that map. It's a foolish undertaking, but nevertheless, it did happen. So all their orders comes from that map. If there is a history of Eritrea has to be told, for example, then that history of Eritrea must not overflow the borders of that map. What happens is, for example, let's say, the history of Eritrea, we could say, the history of the Tigrinyas in Eritrea, you cannot separate it from the history of Tigrinyas in Tigray. For that matter, you cannot separate it from the history of Habeshas in Ethiopia. It's all intertwined. The history of the Danakil of Eritrea, the Afars in Eritrea, you cannot separate it from the history of Afars in Ethiopia because they dealt more with them than with the Kabesa people in Eritrea. The history of the Muslim tribes in the western part of Eritrea is more associated with the same kind of people across the borders with Sudan. Now, what the map did was it brought these three main population groups together. Now the elite are saying, okay, how do we create an Eritrean identity out of all these different histories? The foolishness of it was nothing should overflow the border of Eritrea. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? By simply eliminating the entire history that goes across the border. You eliminate it.
Countries, at least those I know of, are not curved by some divine hand. When people live in a certain area, they grow in numbers and grow into many families with a common ancestors or a perceived common ancestry. They develop a common language, a common culture, and grow to become clans. And then they grow further to become tribes and nations. Usually they occupy a common territory that they identify as theirs. And then they live alongside other tribes or nations. Each tribe depends on its own toil and resources and starts to trade with its neighbors. As tribes and nations grow, there erupts conflicts, competition starts, feuds might erupt, and rivalry starts. At some point, some alliances are forged and the fighting takes a wider scope. In many instances, there are no geographical or natural boundaries like rivers or valleys that divide the neighboring nations. And most of the time, it's nations from remote areas that come and shape the new nations, especially if it's a weak, underdeveloped country that cannot defend itself. Oftentimes, invaders and colonizers come with more sophisticated weapons in bigger numbers and resources. Then, following the Roman dictum, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. They curve territories for themselves and the people living there become their subjects. Of course, that's a very brief explanation of how nation states come into being. And that is how Italian colonizers came, occupied indigenous territories and shaped Eritrea the way it is today, just like any other African country or many countries in other parts of the world. Today I'll focus on Switzerland. In the 17th century, Europeans fought against each other, mainly between Catholics and Protestants. The war came to an end in 1648. Thereafter, the monarchs signed a treaty, the Peace of Westphalia. That treaty identified the meaning of a state, a government, territory, religion, and all aspects of a nation. Thus, the template for the modern nation-state was drawn. Napoleon Bonaparte played a big role in the development of the modern concept of nation-states. As we know, the French Revolution began by eliminating the feudal medieval system in France. In its place, it created the modern system of armies and institutions and laws. The French Revolution hastened the creation of nation-states to the extent that when Napoleon started to invade all of Europe, many states came together to fight and resist the invasion of Napoleon. But without going any further, since my topic is to talk about the diversity of Eritrea, I will talk about the diversity of Switzerland. That's why I picked Switzerland. Modern Switzerland was under the Romans until the 4th century AD. It went through many invasions, notably by the German tribes, until it finally fell under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire divided it into smaller regions based on religious and other considerations. On August 1st, 1291, the fragmented Swiss regions signed a peace charter and decided to keep the autonomous administrative and judicial rule. That day, August 1, is still celebrated as Switzerland's National Day. In 1499, Switzerland gained its independence from the Holy Roman Empire. But civil strife and division between French and German Protestants and Catholics continued for 2 centuries. And in 1797 and 98, Napoleon invaded a bigger chunk of Switzerland and made it a centrally ruled unitary state. But the Swiss territories defended the Confederation and they didn't allow it to fall apart. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna reestablished the old Confederation of Sovereign States and enshrined Switzerland's status of a permanent armed neutrality in international law. At the same time, the Swiss Constitution enshrined a wide range of civil liberties and made far-reaching provisions to maintain cantonal autonomy to placate the vanquished Catholics. They didn't take advantage of the weakness of the Catholics of the time, as some Eritrean fascists contemplate on doing on those they perceive to be weak and vanquished. And to this day, cantonal autonomy and referendum democracy remain a trademark of the Swiss polity. Switzerland has been a very stable, neutral country for the most part of history, even during World War II. And many might not realize that Switzerland became a member of the United Nations in 2002, only 19 years ago. And it has always maintained its cantonal autonomy and remained a pluralistic, diverse nation. If we leave aside the economic, technological, and other fields in which Switzerland excels, politically speaking, there is no difference between Switzerland and Eritrea. Eritreans are where they are now after centuries of intermarriage, interaction with each other, invasions, settlements, oppression, occupation, migrations, displacements, settlements, conversions. That's until the Italians came and carved Eritrea in its modern shape and form. But the country has existed as a Turkish Wilayet province, as a Fung dynasty territory, as an Egyptian territory, partly as an Abyssinian territory. It was ruled by the Fung dynasty, by the Beja, by the Agao, by the Aksumites, and so many others. So the argument that Eritrea is not a nation, it doesn't deserve to be a nation because it was carved or formed by the Italians, is just a lame, misinformed argument. The Italian colonial boundaries was not pulled from thin air. The boundaries were based on the communities and their realities and their history. Even coercive feudal subjugations and operations and invasions didn't create a clean-cut boundary. Tyrants tried forceful assimilations. That also failed. So, the ancestors of present-day Eritrea settled in that area since a long, long time, and their children paid dearly in sweat and blood to assert their freedom and their right over their country. Some fanatic extremists fancy going back in time and arrive at a certain era just to rewrite the history of Eritrea for their own narrow interest. Their favorite timeline is 1890, and that is when the Italians came and occupied Eritrea. But why don't they go farther back? 17th century, 15th century, 9th century, 5th, 2nd? Why stop at 1890? They wouldn't, because their legends informed them to pick that day and claim to rewrite the history of Eritrea and whimsically divide it as they wish. In short, it's a foolish idea driven by the perpetually sprouting historical bigotry and hypocrisy. It's also driven by the never-quenched thirst for bloodshed, mayhem, and chaos. As I mentioned earlier, there are so many people who straddle border areas between 2 or 3 countries. That is the making of history, a development of a nation. Eritrea has its share of that. The world knows that the PFDJ's regime, led by Isaias Afwerki, has mismanaged the country. It hasn't guaranteed security, peace, or any sort of freedoms for its citizens. But that doesn't warrant savagely dismantling the foundations of Eritrea, as some foolish people contemplate. It's a twisted logic. It's chauvinism at its worst. And that's an idea only the bigots and the chauvinists and the extremists can entertain. Now let's hear again what we heard in the beginning, but this time we will substitute the word Eritrea with Switzerland. Let's go there. Okay, let me be in character. Now I will tell you why Switzerland should not be a country, and it's not a country. When we talk about Switzerland, it's the Catholics and Protestants who built the land, who created the very nation of Switzerland, the map somewhere of Switzerland. Now think about this. You're an elite, and you want to create an identity of Swissness, a Swissness based on that map or that map. And there is a history of Switzerland that has to be told, for example. It is a foolish undertaking, but it did happen. So all their orders comes to them from that map. Then that history of Switzerland must not overflow that map. What happens is, for example, let's say the history of Switzerland, we could say the history of the Germans in Switzerland cannot separate it from the histories of Germans in Germany. For that matter, we cannot separate it from the history of Italians in Italy. It's intertwined. Or the history of the French in France. The French in France. You cannot separate it from the history of the French in France, because they dealt with them more than they dealt with the Romanish people in Switzerland. The history of the Protestants, mostly Protestant cantons in the north of Switzerland, parts of Switzerland, is more associated with the same kind of people across the border with Austria. Now, what that map did was, it brought those 4 populations together. Now the elite are saying, okay, how do we create a Swiss identity of all those different histories? The foolishness of it was that nothing should overflow the border of Switzerland. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? By simply eliminating the entire history that goes around that border. You eliminate it. I raised my case. Okay, according to that logic, let's push the Somali Ethiopians to Somalia, the Kenyan Oromos back to Ethiopia, the Benshangul to Sudan, the Afars to Djibouti, and the Djibouti Afars to Eritrea, and the Eritreans to Djibouti. But the world has to do a lot of moving people and displacing them according to this logic. Maybe the Gambella, we push them to Sudan and we take the Nur and put them back in Ethiopia. And then we have the Kenyan-Ethiopian border where the Turkana and Mursi and other tribes live. So what do we do with those people? I don't know. They shouldn't have been in the border area to begin with, if you ask me. So says the twisted logic Happy Twisted Logic Day to you. Save our donut.